This week's Sedra is Parshas Bo, and at the end of Parshas Bo, the mitzvah of Tefillin is discussed. Now, if you look in the English translations of the Chumash, Tefillin is translated as phylacteries. Phylacteries. That's I questions what does phylacteries mean. I searched Webster's dictionary, translates as amulets, pieces of jewelry that contain some parchment or some statement. Anyway, there are four paragraphs of the Torah that are included in the Tefillin. The Tefillin is worn on the head, Tefillin shel Rosh, and there's Tefillin that's worn on the weaker hand. If a person is a righty, so it's worn on the left hand. And if a person is a lefty, according to almost all opinions, it's worn on the right hand. But the mitzvah, but each set of tefillin, the tefillin of the rosh, of the head, the tefillin of the arm, the hand, has four parshios, four paragraphs from the Torah contained in it. Now, the first parsha, the first paragraph of the Torah that is contained in the tefillin is the parsha of Kadesh, which is at the end of this week's Sedra. And Kadesh, the parsha of Kadesh, talks about the special halachic status of the firstborn among the Jewish people, as well as their animals. And this commemorates the saving of the Jewish firstborn on the night of Passover, when the firstborn of the Egyptians all died. And this also, this paragraph that's contained in Tefillin also deals with the laws of matzah and the mitzvah of talking about the mitzvah of talking and telling over to your children about the miracles of Passover. And in a sense, it discusses the laws that have to do with the Seder night. And all of these laws have a connection with Yetzias Mitzrayim, with the Exodus from Egypt. They commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. And the paragraph concludes with the mitzvah of Tefillin, which also is identified with the Exodus from Egypt. The second paragraph contained in the Tefillin, that's V'haya Kibiyacha. And that too, to a large degree, discusses the significance of the Exodus from Egypt and the mitzvos that commemorate that event. The third paragraph that's contained in the Tefillin is the parsha of Shema. Shema is acceptance, recognition of the unity of God, the oneness of God, and it's also the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And the fourth chapter discusses the parsha, and not discusses. It has the parsha of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Excuse me, the parsha of V'haya im Shemoah. V'haya im Shemoah is, in a sense, is a continuation of the Shema. In other words, it talks about the acceptance of the responsibility of doing the mitzvos, of the commandments of God. And it also discusses the reward for the fulfilling of the mitzvos. And it also talks about the punishment for abandoning the commandments of God. Now, so in a sense, the first two parshios, the first two paragraphs that are contained in the Tefillin, and these are paragraphs that are at the end of this week's Sedra, they focus on the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt, the significance of the exodus, some of the mitzvos that commemorate the exodus. And the last two paragraphs that are in the Tefillin, they focus on the idea of acceptance of the yoke of heaven, the recognition of God. That's the Shema and the V'hayim Shemoah. Now, there is a difference in the structure of the tefillin of the hand versus the tefillin of the head of the Rosh. The tefillin of the Rosh, the tefillin of that's on the head, has 4 separate compartments. And each parsha is put in a separate compartment. Each parsha, each paragraph is written on a separate piece of parchment, and each piece of parchment is put in a separate compartment in the tefillin of the head. However, the tefillin shel Rosh and tefillin shel Yad, the tefillin of the arm and the hand, there, all 4 paragraphs are written on one piece of parchment, one long parchment. And there is only one compartment in the tefillin of the arm, of the hand. Now, the question is, why is it that there are 4 separate compartments in the tefillin of the head? And from it seems also that this is what is the source of the fact that there are 4 parshios in the tefillin. And that's both in the 4 paragraphs are written, and that's both regarding the tefillin of the head as well as the tefillin of the arm and hand. The Torah says at the end of this week's Sedra, V'hayu l'totafos beinenecha, in describing the tefillin of the head, it says it should be as a totafos between your eyes. Obviously, we do not place it directly between our eyes, but we put it on top of the head, but between the eyes. Now, where do we deduce? Now, what does the word totafos mean? And it's very interesting. Many of the commentators exclaim, I guess is the better word, than say, that they don't find a similar word in Tanakh. There is a mystery that surrounds this word totafos. What does it mean? The Targum explains it as tefillin, but there is an indication from the Gemara in Shabbos that the word totafos means an ornament. However, Rashi brings down the opinion of Menachem, and Menachem said that the word totafos is similar to words that are associated with speech. And what's the idea? The idea is that when people will see the tefillin on the head of a Jew, they will be reminded of the miracles that took place in Egypt. And then they will go and talk about it. They will spread the word. So the word totafos bears similarity to words that are associated with speech. But why are there 4 sections in the Tefillin of the head and 4 parshios in both the Tefillin of the head as well as in the Tefillin of the arm and hand? That's because the Rashi cites, and this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion, that's mentioned in the Gemara a number of places. One of the places is Sanhedrin. Tot, in the words in the Caspian language, apparently, there was a language spoken, very likely somewhere in the area of the Caspian Sea at that time. So tot means 2. And fos, Rashi says, and that's what Rabbi Akiva says in the Gemara, also means 2, but it means 2 in the African language. So the word totafos is to be understood as 2 plus 2. 2 of the Caspian language, 2 in the African language, and altogether that's 4. So in describing the tefillin of the head, the Torah uses an expression that contains in it a word of the Caspian language that means 2, and a word of the African language that means 2, for a total of 4. And consequently, the Tefillin Shel Rosh, the Tefillin of the head, has 4 sections, 4 compartments. And there are 4, because of that, there are 4 parshios in both the Tefillin Shel Rosh and the Tefillin of the head, as well as in the Tefillin of the hand, of the arm and hand. Now, there is a the commentators on Rashi are somewhat baffled by this idea. Why do we have Exeris HaKosuv? Why do we associate the law of 4 separate compartments and 4 parshios and 4 paragraphs in the Tefillin with foreign language? I saw some of the commentators use the word chas v'shalom, and they give reasons, but I have a lot of trouble with the reasons that they mention. The Taz, in his parish on Rashi, he explains it that since the word totafos was a mysterious word, and they really did not know the true meaning of that word, so our sages felt that since it bears similarity to tot of the Caspian language and fos of the African language, so consequently, those words are probably part of the Hebrew language, part of the foundation, are at the root of the word totafos. And consequently, sometimes when you see a word in another language and you have that same word in the Hebrew language, there is some identification between the two. So they assumed that totafos was not a combination of 2 other languages, but on the contrary, it in Lashon HaKodesh, it meant for. And if anything else, parts of those words were borrowed by the other languages. And other commentaries take it a little bit further. I think I heard this opinion. I saw it brought down in the name of the Sefer Devik Tov. I don't have that Sefer. I don't think I ever used it. But the thought that this Sefer expresses, I heard, I think, from my father in the name of the Shlah. At the time after the flood of Noah, and mankind gathered together in an act of rebellion against God, and they built a great tower. And the tower symbolized their rebellion against the Almighty. And part of the problem was that mankind united in this rebellion against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? Bilbul Lashonos. He mixed up their languages. In other words, at that time, they all spoke the same language. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused that one should not understand the language of the other. And as a result of these Bilbul Lashonos, the mixing up of languages, different groups of different people went to different areas of the world because they couldn't communicate with one another. And so this was Bilbul Lashonos. And the Shlah suggests that the original language was a form of Lashon HaKodesh, was a form of Hebrew. Even though there's a strange medrash that indicates that Adam Arishon spoke Aramaic or Aramaic also, but the Shlah suggests that the original language was Lashon HaKodesh, and the language that those who rebelled against God, interestingly, that they spoke was Hebrew. And because of that, many words of the original Hebrew, of the Lashon HaKodesh, entered other languages as well. So Tot, which was part of the Caspian language, and Fos, which was part of the African language, had its origin in Hebrew and Lashon HaKodesh. But it was not used so much among those who spoke Lashon HaKodesh, but it was used predominantly among the people who spoke the Caspian language and spoke the African language. So that's the reason why Rashi and Rabbi Akiva comment that Tot is two in the Caspian language and Fos is two in the African language. Now, to me, I have a lot of difficulty, although this shot is very interesting. I remember when my father said it, it drew my attention. But why do they emphasize that it's the Caspian language or the African language? If it's all originally part of Lashon HaKodesh, should just make the comment. or mention that it's part of Lashon HaKodesh, or just mention the translation of the words. So I have difficulty assuming that these words are mentioned because they were originally part of Lashon HaKodesh, part of Hebrew. I would like to take Rashi and Rabbi Akiva very literally, that it's part of the Caspian language and part of the African language. But nevertheless, the question that the commentators asked stands strong. Why is it that here the Torah makes a drasha, deduces the halacha, on the basis of understanding a word of the Torah from the perspective of foreign languages, instead of understanding the halacha from the perspective of Lashon HaKodesh? Now, there is a famous machlokes, a famous dispute between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Actually, there are 5 different opinions as to what the order of the Tefillin, are. But I'm going to focus today just on Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam. Rashi Shita is that the Tefillin, the order of the Parshios, of the paragraphs that's put on in the Tefillin, is in the same order that they are in the Torah. You know, it's Kadesh first, Bahaya Kibiyacha second. Those are the 2 Parshios that are in this week's Sedra. Then Shema, which is in Vaschanan, in the Chumash Dvarim, which was said over by Moshe Rabbeinu toward the end of his life. Kadesh and Bahaya Biyacha seems, from a chronological standpoint, to have been told to the Jewish people at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. That's what this Sedra is dealing with. But Shema Bahayim Shemoah, chronologically, is given over in Chumash Dvarim, which was said over by Moshe Rabbeinu, depending how you learn Chumash Dvarim, in the last days of his life. Now, there are some opinions that say that the Shema Bahayim Shemoah was also given over to them at this time. But in the order of the Torah was placed at the end of the Torah. But that's not the simple reading. That's not the simple reading of the Chumash. So Rashi's opinion is that the Parshios, the order of the Parshios, are in the order they are in the Torah. Kadesh first, Bahaya Kibiyacha second. These are the 2 paragraphs that focus on the significance of the Exodus, the importance of remembering the Exodus. The idea that we have to constantly commemorate and remind ourselves about the Exodus. And then you have Shema, the 3rd Parsha, which talks about accepting the yoke of heaven. And then the 4th Parsha, which is the acceptance of the obligation of the mitzvahs. Now, the last 2 Parshios do not mention the Exodus at all. So that's Rashi's opinion. And Rashi's opinion seems to be very logical, because these are partials, these are paragraphs that are taken from the Torah. As a matter of fact, the law is that they have to be written in the same manner as they are written in the Torah. So but Rabbeinu Tam, he has an altogether different opinion. Rabbeinu Tam's opinion is, yes, the first two Parshios are Kadesh and V'haya K'viyacha. The Parshios that deal with the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt, the significance of the exodus. But then, instead of placing Shema before V'haya Shemoah, he places V'haya Shemoah before Shema. You know, it's Shema is the last parsha in the Tefillin, and V'haya Shemoah is beforehand. And we have to understand why should it be that way? Why should it be out of the order of the Torah? Now, my uncle suggested a very interesting answer. I have another answer, but that'll have to be for another time. My uncle suggested we take the Gzeres HaKosav of Totafos, and we saw, what does Totafos mean? Totafos, we said, in the Caspian language means two, and in the African language it means two. So Totafos, in a sense, is an equation, an easy equation. A first grader should be able to understand that equation. 2 + 2 is 4. So Totafos. So the question is it a halacha of 4 parshios, of 4 compartments in the tefillin of the head? Or is it a halacha of 2 sets of 2 compartments? And my uncle suggested that according to Rabbeinu Tam, it is 2 sets of 2 compartments. And each compartment starts from the outside. Now, the one thing that Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam agree is that the Kadesh V'haya K'viyacha, the first 2 parshios, they start not from the right in terms of the order that they're put into the tefillin. In the compartments of the tefillin, they are on the right, not of the one who wears the tefillin, but on the right of the person is opposite him who observes the tefillin. So Rashi's opinion is that it's 4 parshios. So you start with Kadesh on the right of the observer, which is the left of the wearer. And then you have V'haya K'viyacha, the 2 parshios in this week's Sedra that deal with the Exodus. And then we have, going from right to left of the observer, we have the Parsha of Shema, and then lastly, we have the Parsha of V'haya Shemoah. But it's from right to left of the observer. Rabbeinu Tam is somewhat more complicated. Rabbeinu Tam says that when it comes to Shema and V'haya Shemoah, when it comes to Kadesh and V'haya K'viyacha, he agrees with Rashi. He agrees with Rashi that we have it's on the right of the observer. Kadesh is on the right of the observer, followed by V'haya K'viyacha, by the person standing opposite the one who wears tefillin. Shema and V'haya Shemoah, that's a different topic. That doesn't discuss the Exodus. that discusses acceptance of the yoke of heaven. So that's not to be seen as a continuation of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. So that starts from the other side. So we have Shema V'Hayim Shemoah from the left of the observer. So we have two separate groups of parshios. You have the group of parshios that focuses on the Exodus. And that begins from the right of the observer. And then you have Shema V'Haya Im Shemoah, which focuses on the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, which is on the left of the observer. So in a sense, it's not that the parshios are out of order. It's just both sets of parshios. There are two sets of parshios, and each set begins from the outside. One set begins from the outside on the right of the observer, and one set begins on the outside from the left of the observer. But each set is in the order that it is in the Torah. Now, but we have to understand how we can understand what's the logic for Rabbeinu Tam. The logic from Rashi is very simple. We have four parshios, so it's in the order of the Torah. Okay, we have two sets of two parshios, but why should we start both sets from the outside? According to Rabbeinu Tam. Now, there is a pasuk, Ro kol amei haaretz ki shem Hashem nikra elecha v'yaru mimeka, elu tefillin shel barosh. All the nations of the world should see that the name of God is called on you. Amar Rab Lezer Gadol says, how do the nations of the world see that the name of God is called upon you or identified with you? When all the inhabitants of the world, I should say, when they is seen upon you, that's with the tefillin of the rosh, with the tefillin of the head. Now, and because of that, the halacha is that really one should not even cover the tefillin of the head. The tefillin of the arm and the hand, we of course we cover with our sleeves, whatever it is. But the tefillin of the head, ideally, should not be covered up. So, because of that, now we have to understand. Now, and as a matter of fact, there's a very interesting story about the Vilna Gaon. I heard it from my father about the Vilna Gaon when I told it over to a Lubavitcher Chassid. He told me that among Lubavitcher Chassidim, they have a similar story or the same story about the Baal Tanya. It's possible that the event happened with both of them. All right, whatever it is, but both of them were taken prisoner. For whatever reason, they were taken prisoner. It's well known, and both were taken prisoner by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, when the couple of years ago, when the Soviet Union fell apart, and the situation was somewhat more liberal then than it perhaps is today. So they discovered the prison records of Vilna. And in the prison records of Vilna, it's listed that one of the prisoners at that time was Rabbi Eliyahu Chassid, Elijah, the pious one, the pious one. So the Vilna Gaon, for a short while, on false charges that apparently the Russian government realized was false, so they let him out. But so he was listed. The Vilna Gaon's name, everybody says his family name was really Kramer, but probably in Vilna he was known as the Chassid, as the pious one. Today, when we talk about Hasidim, we're talking about a certain group of people who, by the way, at that time the Vilna Gaon opposed. But apparently in Vilna, because of the piety of the Vilna Gaon, he was referred to as the Chassid. And whoever wrote the records, he thought Chassid was the Vilna Gaon's last name. So he wrote in the prison ledger, or whatever it was, that listing the different prisoners in a particular period of time, Rabbi Eliyahu Chassid. So so it happened that they were going to question the Vilna Gaon, and the people who did the questioning were some very, very rough individuals. And when they came in to question the Vilna Gaon was wearing his talis and tefillin. And the one who went in to question the Vilna Gaon was overcome with such fear that he immediately ran out. And he didn't question the Vilna Gaon. Not that there was anything that the Vilna Gaon had to hide, but they just, when they saw it. Well, there was another Jew in prison at the time for other reasons. And he saw what happened with the Vilna Gaon. So he asked the Vilna Gaon, how is it that when they went in to question you, they ran out immediately? And the Vilna Gaon says, it's an explicit pasuk, it's a verse. V'ro kol amei haaretz, when all the people of the land see, Kishem Hashem nikra lecha, the name of God is called upon you, v'yaru mimeka, they will fear you. Fear can mean scared, fear can mean awe, and fear can mean both. He said, and the Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Lezer HaGadol, Rebbe Lezer HaGadol says, what does this pasuk have reference to? Rebbe Lezer HaGadol says, this pasuk, this verse, has reference to the Tefillin Shel Rosh, the tefillin of the head. So the person thought, well, they're going to come in and question me soon also. So he quickly put on his talis, he put on his tefillin, and they came in to question him, and they beat him up. And the man went to the Vilna Gaon, he says, how is it? When they came into you, they ran away. I was also, and you say, because you were wearing talis and tefillin. I was also wearing talis and tefillin. How come they beat me up? They didn't run away. So the Vilna Gaon says, it doesn't say Elul Tefillin Sha'al Harosh. It doesn't mean these are the tefillin on the head. It says tefillin shebarosh, the tefillin in the head. He said, with you put on the tefillin not because of what the tefillin represents, not because there's a mitzvah of tefillin, not because you are trying to improve yourself in Yirah Shamayim, in fear of God, in awe of heaven, in commitment of mitzvos. You put it on because you wanted them to run away from you. That means that tefillin were not part of you. It was something separate from you. They were on top of your head. They weren't in your head. It had no impact on your thinking, the tefillin. Whereas when I put on tefillin, I put on the tefillin, as the Rambam discusses in Hilchos Tefillin, because of the impact that tefillin has on should have on the Jew. When all the nations of the world, all the people of the world will see that the name of God is called upon you, they will fear you. That's only when it's tefillin shebarosh, tefillin in the head. But what do we see from this story? We see from this story, whether it was the Balatanya or it was the Gra, that when we say the tefillin shebarosh is something that has an impact on the observer. Most mitzvos, when we do the mitzvos, if it's supposed to have an impact, and tefillin certainly is that way, it's an impact on the one who does the mitzvah. Tefillin of the head, it's not only supposed to have an impact on those who are doing the mitzvah, but tefillin of the head has to have an impact even on the observer as well. Should have an impact on the observer as well. And that's why the tefillin shebarosh, the tefillin of the head, should not be covered up, ideally. So but it seems from the story that it has to have an impact on the observer. We're not just talking about observers who are Jewish, but we're talking about observers who are not Jewish as well. V'ro kol amei haaretz. All the people of the world, when they see the tefillin shebarosh, if it's done properly and for the right purposes, v'yaru mimeka, and they will fear you. So in other words, the tefillin shebarosh is not just for the wearer, but as I said before, it's for the observer as well. And the observer includes non-Jews as well. That doesn't mean that when you go to demonstrations, there's a new thing I notice. When they want to go to demonstrations, they can be demonstrating about anything. They'll wear a talis, they'll wear tefillin. Then the talis and tefillin is not talis and tefillin. Then the talis and tefillin are costumes. The tefillin and the talis have to be worn for their true purpose, not as a costume. So now, when a non-Jew, now we said that according to Rabbeinu Tam, the first two Parshios, the Parshios in this week's Sedra of Kadesh and V'Hayav, which focuses on the Exodus, not so much on the Kabbalah Sol Malchus Shemayim and Kabbalah Sol Mitzvos. That's on the right of the observer. Why? Because just doing mitzvos by itself is not likely to inspire the nations of the world. What inspires the nations of the world, and what does Yetzias Mitzrayim represent? Yetzias Mitzrayim is not just Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's not just the exodus from Egypt. Yetzias Mitzrayim is seeing God in the history of the Jew, in the events of the day of the Jew. I remember during the 6-Day War, in the Chicago Tribune, they had a picture of an Arab, and behind him was a big bear representing the Soviet Union, who at that time were the supporters of the Arab nations. And then this is just after the victory of the 6-Day War. And then there was a young teenager, Jewish teenager, with short pants. Those days, they would identify the Chalutzim, the Israelis, as a young person. And I guess we have grown old. And behind him was a lightning bolt, and on the lightning bolt, it said, "The God of Israel." And this young fellow, this young Jew, wearing those funny chalutzim hats, points to the lightning bolt and he says, "I have a big brother also." This cartoon was not made by a Jew. This was a cartoon in the Chicago Tribune. So not known for its friendliness to Israel, but nevertheless, the victory of Israel had an impact on the nations of the world, not just on the Jewish community. It certainly was a magnet to draw people to recognize the special relationship that God has with the Jewish people. The Jews, for sure. I would suggest that more than anything else, what inspired the Balcherva movement was the victory of the 6-Day War. I think, so what inspires those who are not yet putting on tefillin, those who are only observers, the role that God plays in the history of the Jew? And that began with Yetzias Mitzrayim. Therefore, the Parshas, the paragraphs of the Torah that deal with the exodus from Egypt are on the right of the observer. Because we know in Hebrew, we go from right to left. You look at the right first. But the Parshas of accepting the yoke of heaven, that's on the left of the observer, but it's on the right of the wearer. The one who is committed to Torah and mitzvos. Because with him, it all begins with acceptance of saying Shema Yisrael, just as it does in Kriya Shema. We accept the yoke of heaven. Yetzias Mitzrayim is important, but it starts off with the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. And I think that perhaps it is to emphasize this idea that V'ro kol amei haaretz ki shem Hashem nikra elecha v'yaru mimeka, that all the nations of the world will recognize that the name of God is called on you. Elu tefillin shabarosh, that's the tefillin of the head. It's to emphasize, in order to emphasize this idea that tefillin shel rosh is identified with the word totafos. Tot. Bekasti shtayim. Tot in the Caspian language means two. Fos in the African language means two. In other words, when we deal with Tefillin Shel Rosh, of course, the purpose of Tefillin Shel Rosh is to have an impact upon ourselves. But Tefillin Shel Rosh has this unique feature that it's supposed to inspire and have and warn in a way that's symbolic of the impact that the Jewish people have to have on the nations of the world. But we have an impact by them seeing God in our lives. Not so much by seeing us in their lives. The Jewish people, a matter of fact, there are those that say, I think the Meshech Chachma, I don't remember who, that the word totafos means separation, to separate ourselves. The tefillin separates ourselves. Why? Because the Jewish people, and I mentioned it in previous year, the Jewish people have the greatest impact not when they are part of the nations of the world, but when they are separate, when they are as the Jewish people. That doesn't mean we can't be concerned, we can't be involved. We certainly have to be concerned. We have to be involved. As I always mention, when Avram Avinu was after the bris milah, after his circumcision, after he separated himself, completed his separation from the rest of the world, that's when the Torah tells us about how concerned he was about travelers, traveling the desert, who were idol worshipers. So we have to be concerned about others. But that concern that we have about others cannot be used to dilute our separateness. Now, and this is the idea. So the idea of the Tefillin Shel Rosh is for the Jewish people to have an impact, but you could call it an indirect impact. They learn from us. How did the world come to recognize monotheism? It was from the Jewish people. We don't go out and try to impose our religion on others. We are not missionaries. But long term, we have an impact because of the way we act. But that's only true if we act properly. Now, according to Rashi, According to Rashi, however, Rashi is of the opinion that all four parshios are straight from the perspective of the observer. It starts from the right of the observer, going to the left of the observer, in the order they are in the Torah. It's not two separate groups of two, but it's four parshios. How we to understand it? But the way we understand it is that the Tefillin commemorates Yetzias Mitzrayim. It commemorates the exodus of the Jew. It commemorates the freedom of the Jew. It begins with Kadesh and V'hayik V'yacha, which is the exodus from slavery, the exodus from Egypt. But it's the formation of the Jewish nation. We only can maintain our freedom if our king, our ultimate king, is God, and God of the Jews, who ultimately will be the God of the whole world. So it starts, in other words, there are two perspectives, and both perspectives are true. One perspective is that acceptance, the yoke of heaven, that's part of the Exodus. And we see some, in certain regards, Shavuos, as the Ramban says, is like the Shmini Atzeres of Pesach. It's connected to Pesach. Why? Because the ultimate freedom, the completion of the Exodus process was the giving of the Torah. When we got the Torah, so we had our own ways, our own culture. We had our own king. We had the potential to recognize that Paro was no longer king over us. Yes, we had left Egypt, but there was the servile perspective. And the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments, begins, Anochi Hashem Lakecha Asher Tzeisecha Me'eretz Mitzrayim Mibeis Abadim. I am the God who took you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. To a certain degree, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, the recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is the completion, or if you want, the beginning of the completion of the Exodus process. Avodaihem v'lo avodim v'avodim. They are my servants and not the servants of other servants. We have to make ourselves free. And we make ourselves free by accepting the yoke of heaven. And so, on the other hand, as we do in Shema, the third parsha, the third paragraph of the Shema is about the Exodus. First, we have Shema B'Hayim Shemoah, which is acceptance of the yoke of heaven, acceptance of God as King, the oneness of God. Then we mention Yetzias Mitzrayim, then we mention the Exodus. Why? Because the Exodus represents our accepting God, not just as King of the world, but King of the Jewish people specifically. So God acquired us. God was always king, but to a certain degree, kingship is limited unless it's recognized. A Moshe, someone who is in control, someone who has power over us, is not completely a king. A king is somebody that is accepted by the people. And to a certain degree, we say, V'haya Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz. God will be king over the whole land. But right now, unfortunately, mankind has not accepted God nor his laws. And because mankind has not accepted God, God's kingship is somewhat limited. And God acquired us, and the people belong to their king. We see that some of the Rishonim explain, why is the law of the king the law of the land? Because the people, to a certain degree, belong to the king. God acquired us when we left Egypt. And in a sense, we recognized that, and we accepted him when we accepted the Torah. So the Exodus, on one hand, acceptance of the yoke of heaven, acceptance of God, that's part of the Exodus. On the other hand, the Exodus is part of the acceptance of God and the acceptance of the Torah. And I think Rashi saw all the four Parshas as, from the perspective, it starts with Yetzias Mitzrayim, it starts with the Exodus, because acceptance of the yoke of heaven is something that is part of the freedom of the Jew. Is part of the freedom of the Jew. And we want the nations of the world, they come to recognize, they see the Jewish people's acceptance of God as a result of their recognition of the significance of God helping the Jewish people in their history, and specifically in the events of the Exodus. Now, I just want to mention, it's interesting that the Ramban, he mentions that the mitzvah of Mezuzah, to a certain degree, is associated with Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Ramban in this week's Sedra, at the end of this week's Sedra, is associated with the Exodus. And the question is asked by many, how is it associated with the Exodus? What does the Mezuzah have? The Mezuzah has two parshios, two paragraphs. It has Shema and it has V'haya Shemoah, neither of which explicitly mentions the Exodus. And the number of answers, I mentioned the name of the Brisker Rav. The most famous answer is, it's true, it's not mentioned in the Mezuzah, but the Mezuzah mentions the mitzvah of Tefillin. And the mitzvah of, and in Tefillin, the Exodus mentioned the Kadesh and V'haya K'biyacha. The paragraphs dealing with the Exodus are mentioned. So ultimately, through the Mezuzah, we demonstrate our identification with the Exodus. I wanted to suggest two other answers. One answer is that the blood was placed at the time of the Makas Bechoros, at this week's Sedra. The blood was placed in the doorway, on the lintel, on the sides of the doorway. The blood from the Korban Pesach, from the Passover sacrifice. Blood generally was sprinkled on the altar, but here it was sprinkled and it remained for a while on the doorway of the house. And when we did it on the doorway of a house, it wasn't just some kind of magic. It represented our rejection of the Egyptian culture. It represented our devotion to God, our commitment to God. And we demonstrated it not by putting the blood on the inside of the house, but by putting it on the outside of the house. Because true commitment cannot be limited to inside the house. We reject the idea that you should be a Jew inside the house and not Jewish outside the house. There were those in Germany who said you can be a Jew inside the house and a German outside the house. You can be a Jew, you can be an American inside the house and an American outside the house. But that has to be part of being a Jew inside the house and being outside the house, and not the reverse of that. So we had to demonstrate to the nation, to the Egyptians, our commitment to God. Because unless we're ready to demonstrate it to them, we don't really have that commitment. As I mentioned, by the Hanukkah candles are lit by the doorway opposite the Mezuzah, because the Greeks tried to use the doorway to stop the Jews from being committed to God. They would come in without warning to see if the Jews were doing the mitzvos. So we demonstrate at the door that we're committed, where everybody could see, Jew or non-Jew. And because of that, that shows our true commitment. So in order to symbolize that the dam, the blood, was represented the idea of Kabbalah Malchus Shemayim, acceptance of the yoke of heaven. There is a mitzvah putting a mezuzah, which represents the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. But I think there's another explanation, and actually it might be the same explanation, as I said before. The acceptance of the yoke of heaven, that is the completion of the Exodus, that is the completion of being free. Because only when God is our king and we accept him as our king, can we be free. Until that time, until the Torah becomes our culture, then the culture of the nations of the world is our culture. And if it's a foreign culture, we are still slaves. There might be times when we're not slaves in the fields and working for our masters, but our culture, the culture that we are practicing, will make us cultural slaves to the nations of the world. The acceptance of the Torah, the acceptance of mitzvos, that is our culture, and that is our true freedom. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. Also, it looks like 10:30 is going to be our time going forward from here on in. So just check your notices when you get your email notice of the share. Okay, no questions yet. Are there 57 ways to put on tefillin? What did Volozhiner say?
64. It's more than that. The Gross said 64.
Should we be happy that we saw that in the video there was someone dressed up in a Santa Claus costume in Israel that was putting tefillin on.
If you're a psychiatrist and you're going to want a new customer, you'd be happy.
Okay, what were the words of speech associated with tefillin? I think you're talking about totafos.
Totafos, yeah, yeah. So because you'll talk about the Exodus from Egypt, is what Menachem said. That's where Rashi quotes Rabbi Menachem. He calls him Menachem, not Rabbi Menachem. Okay.
I think it's that totafos is made up of two words, tot, which was in the Caspian language meant two, and fos in the African language meant two.
That's right. That's what he said.
How is it to be understood about the 64 ways to put on tefillin?
There are different theories about that. If somebody wants, I could recommend the sefer that discusses at length, actually, Lubavitcher's sefer. It's called Ashkafta the Rebbe. It was written by Rav Dober Ripkin. He was a Talmud. He was, first of all, one of the Rosh Yeshivas of Torah Das, and a great Gaon. And he was a Talmud of the Rashab, of the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. So there he discusses the different opinions about different shitos of tefillin, and he suggests what the 64 different pairs of tefillin are. If somebody wants, they can go look it up in that sefer. Ashkafta, it happens to be a very good sefer, by the way. It's a good sefer, not only lumdus-wise, but even reading style-wise of writing. It's a very good sefer.
I was going to say, it's hard to get that book because the Lubavitch Library, as far as I knew, did not have that book in it. But now I see that it is up on HebrewBooks.org. So I just put the link to that book in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. Actually, but he didn't go along. The rumor is that the Rebbe, when he saw the manuscript, he wanted to write Ha'aros on it. But the Rav Rifkin printed it beforehand. So the Rebbe's Ha'aros were never printed. He probably never wrote them. So that was, but he was interested in writing notes. That's what I was told.
So did your father mention that we shouldn't put on Rabbeinu Tam, because if you put on Rabbeinu Tam, you need to put on 60 something other pairs of tefillin?
No, Reb Chaim Volozhiner used to put on Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. The Vilna Gaon said to him that if you put on, why Rabbeinu Tam? If you want to be Yotzei Ol Shitas, you should put on 64 pairs of tefillin. The Shulchan Aruch says that a Yerushalayim will put on both. And the Vilna Gaon said in other words, the Vilna Gaon was the opinion that Rashi was correct. So he said, but if you want to be machmer for other shitos, for other opinions, so then you would have to put on 64 pairs of tefillin. It actually would be more, I'm told. But but I guess the major shitos was 64 pairs. Someone once wanted to open up like a museum, and they would have all 64 pairs of tefillin, and that somebody could, once in their lifetime, could go around and put all 64 pairs of tefillin on. So at least once in their lifetime, to be yotzei every shita. But today, to fulfill according to every opinion, but today you'll need a much bigger building. Not just because of the number of people, but because of the number of shitos.
Okay, I didn't want to bring this up. I was just reading an article about can you tell people to be lenient on certain mitzvahs when they get OCD and they get worried all day that they didn't fulfill a mitzvah properly?
So that's a complicated question. It's a question that I have had to deal with. It was asked of me a number of times, but there is no general rules. It varies from case to case. And obviously there's a difference when somebody is concerned that that maybe he did not have kavana, the proper kavana during davening, or he thought that he's going to make a neder to give this $1 million to tzedakah, as you sometimes see with someone who's OCD, or people who are scared that they touched something and they have to constantly wash their hands, or someone who wants a heter to eat things that are not kosher. So, and I've had to deal with all of these situations, and a person has to. There are different cases with different situations with different people, and everything has to be evaluated on the basis of the individual case. I wouldn't give general guidance in this. It has to be on an individual basis. And of course, sometimes it could even involve sakonos nefashos, but it has to be evaluated on an individual basis.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here, and Mir Tashem next week at the 10:30.
Okay.